Listen closely because this feed will be cut the moment the algorithm flags the keywords I am about to use. So you need to understand that what you are witnessing in the first weeks of 2026 is not a geopolitical restructuring, but a controlled demolition of the illusion of sovereignty executed by a transnational syndicate that uses national governments as skin suits to enforce their will. The media is calling it aggressive resource realism, which is a sanitized Orwellian euphemism for high seas piracy and corporate looting on a planetary scale, essentially marking the transition from the covert subversion of the last century to the overt gangsterism of the new millennium, where the mask has finally fallen off the American empire to reveal the resource-hungry Leviathan underneath. You have to look at the timing of Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela, because it was not a reaction to a threat, but a scheduled liquidation of a distressed asset decided upon in the closed-door boardrooms of the Carlyle Group and BlackRock long before the first boot hit the ground in Caracas. They tell you this was a surgical raid to capture a narco-terrorist, but that is the manufactured consent narrative fed to you by the mockingbird press to justify the deployment of Joint Special Operations Command assets, which are acting as the private enforcement arm of the energy lobby. Ask yourself why the USS Iwo Jima was positioned exactly where it was, and why the air defense nodes in Katia Lamar were suppressed with such specific precision. It is because those target coordinates were likely provided by the very defense contractors who built the systems in the first place, ensuring a seamless transfer of property from the sovereign state of Venezuela to the ledgers of Chevron and ExxonMobil, who are the only real beneficiaries of this coup. The 23 dead Venezuelan soldiers and 32 Cuban security personnel are just line items in an acquisition merger written in blood. The Cartel of the Sun's indictment is a legal fiction, a weaponized piece of paper drafted by Department of Justice lawyers who revolve in and out of the same white shoe law firms representing the oil majors, creating a precedent where any head of state who refuses to privatize their natural resources can be branded a criminal enterprise and extracted like a wisdom tooth. This is the new Monroe Doctrine, which isn't about protecting the hemisphere from foreign influence, but about securing a captive supply chain for the reindustrialization of the North American bloc. When they announced the U.S.-Venezuela energy deal just 72 hours later, it was the smoking gun proving that the Department of Energy is now functioning as the colonial administrator for the occupied territories, placing the proceeds of Venezuelan crude into U.S.-controlled accounts, which is nothing short of financial enslavement marketed as liberation. They are bypassing PDVSA's management structure not to rehabilitate the grid, but to strip mine the infrastructure for every drop of heavy crude to suppress global prices just enough to keep the American consumer sedated while the military-industrial complex ramps up for the real war. Look at the seizure of the Olena and the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to the Caribbean, which is a massive overkill for a counter-narcotics operation unless you realize that the aircraft carrier is there to enforce a mafia-style protection racket over the shipping lanes, ensuring that no molecule of oil leaves the basin without a tithe being paid to the U.S. Treasury. This blockade creates an uninsurable risk that benefits the Lloyds of London syndicates and maritime insurers who can now charge war zone premiums on everything moving south of Miami. Meanwhile, the silence from the European capitals is deafening because they are terrified knowing that the Maduro model of kidnapping heads of state could easily be applied to them if they step out of line with the Washington consensus. This brings us to the Arctic ultimatum, which is the second pincer of this resource war, where the mask of NATO unity is being shredded to get at the rare earth minerals in Greenland. The administration's offer to buy Greenland wasn't a joke, it was a threat, and the cash for sovereignty payout strategy is straight out of the corporate raider playbook designed to bypass the government in Copenhagen and bribe the population, directly effectively dissolving the social contract of a sovereign nation. They need the dysprosium and terbium at Kvanefjeld, not for green energy, but to build the guidance systems for the next generation of kinetic weapons that Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are currently billing the taxpayer trillions to develop. The threat to militarily annex Greenland creates a fortress Arctic, preventing China from breaking the monopoly on the minerals required to build the surveillance state's hardware. The fracture within NATO, with Denmark issuing shoot-first orders, is the collapse of the post-WWII security architecture that the Bilderberg Group meticulously maintained for decades. But now that the resource crunch is here, the alliance is being cannibalized because loyalty doesn't keep the lights on or the factories running. While the West eats itself, the strike on Lviv with the Oreshnik missile was the Russian oligarchy, signaling to the Western oligarchy that the rules of engagement have changed. The use of dummy warheads wasn't a failure, it was a Masonic handshake, a terrifying display of physics intended to show that there is no defense against a Mach 10 kinetic impactor, and that the Patriot batteries selling for billions are effectively scrap metal against this new tech. By striking the gas storage near Stry, Putin is holding a knife to the jugular of Europe's energy grid, ensuring that the winter will be cold and dark unless the sanctions are lifted. The pause in U.S. military aid to Ukraine isn't about budget cuts. It's a strategic withdrawal to let Europe take the fall, creating a vacuum that forces the EU to militarize its own economy, benefiting the European branches of the same defense contractors like Rheinmetall, who are seeing their stock prices go parabolic. The narrative of the Eastern Front is collapsing to make way for the Persian tinderbox, where the intelligence community is running Operation Ajax 2.0 in Iran, using the internal protest as a cover to dismantle the regime not for human rights, but to seize the third prong of the global energy trident. The death to Khamenei chants are being amplified by bot farms operating out of Northern Virginia and Tel Aviv, creating the pretext for a decapitation strike that would mirror the Caracas operation. If they take Iran offline, they control the Strait of Hormuz, and by extension the global thermostat of the economy. The chaos in the markets, the flight to gold at $5,000 an ounce and Bitcoin at $90,000, is the smart money realizing that the fiat experiment is over and that the U.S. dollar is now a weapon of mass destruction that destroys the wealth of anyone holding it who doesn't bow to the new imperial management. The defense supercycle is the only growth industry left because war is the business model and peace is a bug in the system. The ban on stock buybacks for defense contractors is the state forcing these companies to build the capacity for a total war economy. We are watching the consolidation of planetary resources into the hands of a few techno-feudalist warlords who meet in Davos to divide up the spoils while distracting you with the theater of politics. The digital yuan interest payments are the first shots in the currency war that will bifurcate the global financial system, forcing every human being to choose between a surveillance coin backed by the U.S. military or a surveillance coin backed by the Chinese Communist Party. There is no third option in their game plan. The seizure of Venezuela, the ultimatum to Greenland, and the hypersonics over Lviv are all part of the same tightening noose. They are building a world where you own nothing, and they own everything, including the physics of the atmosphere and the ground beneath your feet. This is the return of Imperial Realism, where the only law is force, and the only crime is weakness. You need to wake up and realize that the map you learned in school is gone, and we are living in the raw, unclaimed territory of a new dark age, where the corporations are the kings, and we are just the serfs on their digital plantation.